We are gathered here today to debate the resolution that this House would admire Sisyphus. And without further ado, I called the Prime Minister up to the stand to give a 5-minute speech, 30-second grace time.
Period. Grace period. Not grace time.
Anytime.
I think I'm going to send this to Mr. Evans, by the way, just letting you know. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the longest time, Sisyphus has been painted as some villain by the Greeks and by the Romans, because they believed that we should never challenge God. And they believed that the punishment Sisyphus got was truly terrible, pushing up a boulder, having hope that he would escape, just for it to fall every day. But the Greeks were wrong. And it was this wrong that got them killed, that got their empires to fall. They believed that ambition, that ingenuity, that hope, and that this pursuit for meaning was bad. They did not understand the fundamental human experience. And it is for that rationale that the fundamental human experience is so important that we are proud to present this resolution that this House admires Sisyphus. We have 3 reasons for you today, Mr. Speaker, why you and all other regular people should admire Sisyphus. Our first reason is ingenuity. He was so creative in his life. Our second reason is hope, the hope he constantly has to push that boulder up. And a third contention is the pursuit of meaning that Sisyphus goes through every single day. All of which tie back to what makes us human. I'd like to start with ingenuity, our first contention. I want to stress how innovative and daring Sisyphus was in life. He was the first person who literally caught death. Death came in to get a soul from him. And he caught the concept of death. He also tricked the gods repeatedly with his ingenuity and creativity. And in Greek mythology, we all know that God really just represents nature. And we still go through this combat with nature every single day, trying to gain the upper hand with medicine, with dams, all of which goes by these same values that we see in Sisyphus, thus connecting him to our fundamental human experience. What is your question?
Do you believe that Adolf Hitler should be celebrated and lauded for his amazing military mind and ability to persuade people?
I think that should Hitler have had a lot of good qualities, it could be plausible to celebrate some of those qualities. That being said, Hitler is so overwhelmingly known for massacring people for no good military reason that sort of blocks that out. But anyway, ingenuity is a single reason for why we should admire Sisyphus, and that reason really should be alone. But I'm prepared to offer more, Mr. Speaker, such as hope, our second contention. And under this contention, we have 2 subpoints. We have his ambition in life and his persistence in death. In his ambition in life, he always wanted more, always. And he was never satisfied by what he got. This is the fundamental concept of human achievement, of human striving that goes to our fundamental human experience. His persistence in death is even more important. He pushes a boulder up a hill every single day to see it fall. And yet he keeps trying because he has hope. And if there's one fundamental thing about people that ought to be admired. It is our hope that strengthens our fundamental human experience. Hope should be alone enough of a reason for admiring Sisyphus. But even if those two were not enough, we are prepared to offer a third reason, a pursuit of meaning that is fundamental to how we operate. And here we again have two subpoints. One, that he creates a meaning for all those existentialists out there. And two, that he has a pursuit of discovering meaning that we all should embrace. But I would like to leave that for my second speech. For now, I would like to remind you about the ingenuity that Sisyphus had both in life and in death, and the hope that he held both in the overworld and in the underworld. To tell you that Sisyphus is not some villain as painted by the Greeks and the Romans. He is, in many ways, a role model that we ought to look up to. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sammy, can you pause the recording for a second? As well?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, to a certain extent, the opposition agrees with government that the myth of Sisyphus represents aspects of human experience, and it does actually clue us in on what makes us human. However, it does so as a warning tale, because Sisyphus represents all of the short-sightedness, immorality, and lack of character of humanity that the Greeks and Romans were trying to warn us against. And yes, we do see many modern things that people fallaciously admire, but the wisdom of these civilizations and the things that keep us continually talking about this myth is how we should not be like Sisyphus, regardless of what the government believes. And for these reasons, the opposition is proud to oppose the resolution that this House would admire Sisyphus. Now, we think that just because someone is a human or has many experiences, that does not make them admirable. In fact, quite the opposite. So that is why the rationale for our case is that humanity should admire people who offer beneficial perspectives, a perspective that not only is relatable, but actually better than the status quo and something that makes us improve as humans. So just because Sisyphus represents the worst of us as a representative of the human experience, that is actually not a reason to admire him at all. So even if you agree with their rationale, that does not mean that we should pass this resolution. Now, in my speech, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to introduce three contentions, three independent reasons why this resolution is absurd and why Sisyphus is not at all an admirable figure. And then I will go on to refute the contentions made by the government. Now, we have three contentions. First, that Sisyphus represents a failure of adaptability. Second, that his actions were immoral. And third, that he was unwise and not smart. Now, on to my first contention, that Sisyphus represents a failure to adapt. And for this, I want to tell everyone a story. Now, there is a widely celebrated measure of grit and perseverance that was once held as a very strong indicator of success. People thought that if you can just stick to one path and go through it and stay dedicated, that you could be successful. And one of the biggest places where this belief was held was the army, a place where perseverance and grit is required. And so they studied the results of a test on grit for all the students who are entering the Naval Academy. And they saw that indeed, the people who didn't have perseverance didn't make it as military officers, and the people with the lowest scores tended to drop out early. But here's what's interesting. The people who did have grit stuck it out for 5 years. But after those 5 miserable years, they then dropped out after wasting a lot more of the military's time and money. And the people that were able to quickly realize when something was for them or not and quit early were actually measured to be happier with their later careers. And that is the fundamental problem with the way modern society views work and the way the government has construed Sisyphus's hope as a laudable achievement. Because we shouldn't celebrate a single-minded pursuit that, connecting back to a rationale, is an unhealthy perspective. Because it's not always true that you should continue on the path that you're on without challenging it, without stepping back and having introspection and telling yourself, am I suffering by doing this? And should I continue doing it if it's not right for me? And we see this blatant careerism infecting America, where people think that it's not okay to start over and that they're mired in this sunk cost fallacy mindset where they think that just because they've been doing something, they should continue to do it. And Sisyphus is the mythological embodiment of that, because in a sense, we are all just pushing boulders up hills mindlessly through school, through college, through careers, and it's making us more depressed and more tragic as a society. So Sisyphus is endorsing the worst of what modern society is offering, and that's what we are being warned against. Yes?
Would you suggest that it would be good if instead of just having the people with less perseverance drop out, everyone in the army dropped out at the beginning?
I think the people who stayed for 5 years in the army and then dropped out were those that should have dropped out far earlier, but bought into the toxic notion of admiring Sisyphus. And the people that stayed in the army and found that it was good for them made the right decision. But that requires introspection and self-deliberation that Sisyphus is against. Now on to our second condition, and that of immorality. Now we asked in our point of information about whether Hitler should be admired for his ingenuity in his actions. And the government basically said no, because overwhelmingly it's not important. Sisyphus's actions were extremely immoral, perhaps not on the scale of Hitler, but on the very same. He broke the rules of life. He attacked a god. And not only that, in his selfish pursuit of life, he lied to his family and subjected his wife to years of torment as well, because the gods wanted to punish this thing. Sisyphus is also the embodiment of arrogance. He is immoral because he believes that he, more than other people, deserves to live, that he is entitled to something that everyone else does not have. And he doesn't care who he hurts to get what he wants. And that is not something that we should be emulating. Is that not something we should be admiring? Because that immoral perspective of trying to cheat death is not what we should want. But not only is it an immoral perspective, it's also an unwise one. And again, Sisyphus represents a fallacy of the mind that is weirdly prevalent in modern society. And that is for two reasons that it is unwise. First, that death is inherently impossible to avoid, as the myth tells us. And second, that death is actually what gives life meaning, and trying to escape it is short-sighted. Now, the first myth is just what the myth of Sisyphus is telling us, that you can't outrun death forever, and that you can try, but it's just not going to work out. And so to continue to try to prolong death and to continue pushing boulders up hills and refusing to give up out of some misguided notion that Hades will actually let him out of death shows a lack of wisdom, because he's just not willing to give up on that perspective. And second, Sisyphus is too short-sighted to actually have made meaning of his life. He spent the last 30 years of his life as a fugitive, hiding from the gods, convinced that that was what was important, to just stay alive. But in that pursuit, he never actually gave his life a meaning outside of it itself. And they're going to bring up the pursuit of meaning in their next speech. But we believe that we shouldn't just try to find meaning outside of the norms, but deal with the circumstances we are given. Now, I now want to address the three contentions given by the government. First, of ingenuity, second, of hope, and I will leave the third contention for when they elaborate on it more. Now, again, back to the point of ingenuity. They have compared Sisyphus to those that make leaps in medicine. All he did was go behind a door and then jump Thanatos and tie him up. It wasn't some clever scheme or brilliant invention. It was just brutish violence, which no one thought to do, because other people were wise enough to recognize that death was natural and accept it. Sisyphus wasn't that genius. He was just unwise and stupid enough to try something that people hadn't. And unlike medicine and unlike other conquests of nature, as they called it, Sisyphus did it for himself. And we shouldn't celebrate this self-serving ingenuity, because we see the wealthy in modern society have that. They're incredibly intelligent, but they're hoarding more and more of our resources, and we are lauding them, and that's a problem, because we should direct ingenuity and intelligence to good means. So Sisyphus not only isn't that smart, but his intelligence also represents a self-serving and immoral intelligence that isn't what we want to endorse. And second, to the notion of hope, that directly goes against our first and third contentions, which is that this meaningless ambition without perspective is misguided and not what we should be continuing to push on an increasingly careerist American public. And second, that his persistence in death represents a lack of wisdom to find meaning in life and move past that. And so we had three reasons why this resolution must fall. that we must be adaptable as a species, that we must look beyond ourselves and guide our ingenuity to benefit, and we must be wise. For these reasons, it must fall. Thank you. 7 minutes without having started refutations.
I forgot the time, so I didn't know.
I was like 8:30 and like 01.
I didn't really catch much of your refutation for my second contention.
I mean, I guess I basically, like, I was running out of time, so I just said my first and third, so that like ambition and like never being satisfied is unwise, and it's like pushing that career narrative. And instead of persistence and death, we should learn to find meaning in life. And that was like unwise. And so like he just kept doing the same thing. So like my contentions were a refutation, basically. Oh, I call the Minister of the Crown to give an 8-minute speech with 30 seconds grace, period.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start with our central rationale again, our fundamental human experience. Now, the opposition came up and they told you that that is not enough. Even if you believe Sisyphus represents the fundamental human experience, you should not pass this resolution. But if it was not for our fundamental human experience, if it is not for our fundamental experience, if we don't have our fundamental human experience, then what do we have? What meaning is there to life besides what makes us people? What makes everything around us beautiful? And it is because we are so in support of this rationale that we must insist that you vote in favor of this resolution, that this House admires Sisyphus. I would like to start by responding to some of opposition's contentions. The first one was that Sisyphus is unadaptable, that this perseverance and grit that they maintain, that they agree that Sisyphus has, is not good. They pointed to a study in the army where certain people with a lot of grit ended up not doing well, or ended up serving themselves poorly in the long run because they dropped out after a long time. There are two problems with this argument that they are making. The first is that presumably many people who were fit for the military but did not have enough grit never made it into the later channels. For example, in debate, often people who actually end up enjoying debate, right, in a few years, realize that they quit in the first place because they did not have enough grit or determination. Furthermore, if everyone who thought that they may not be fit had dropped out instantly from the army, which is a really hard thing to stay in the army would have barely any people, which is obviously bad. It's not a single-minded pursuit to have grit. It's more complicated than that in real life. But Sisyphus represents that grit is necessary for us to do a lot of things. What is your question?
Do you believe that 1,000 years or longer is an adequate amount of time to figure out, or just as a long time?
Yeah, but what's Sisyphus gonna do if he doesn't spend his time pushing the boulder up the cliff? Sit there and think? He has one chance at freedom to push that boulder, and he has persevered. He has grit, and he's going to achieve his goal someday. Their second contention was that Sisyphus was immoral, that he cheated God, subjected his family to pain, and was arrogant. And look, we're not denying that Sisyphus was a bad guy, but Thomas Jefferson was also arrogant. But Alexander Hamilton also subjected his family to pain. Yes, people all have problems, but we are admiring Sisyphus. We are looking at him, up to him in some way, not in every way. He has problems, but the values he represents are of the fundamental human experience. Their final contention was that they said that Sisyphus was unwise, that he should have realized death is inevitable and never tried to do any of the stuff he did. But this is not unwise. This is daring, because as he conceded, no one had ever tried it before him. No one knew whether death is truly inevitable. They just thought they did. Sisyphus pushed the boundaries with its exploration and daring attitude. So if anything, this should be a point in favor of this resolution. They also said that death gives life meaning, and Sisyphus did not embrace that. But they're going to have to back that up a little bit more. They have to prove that impermanence is what gives life meaning, and not all the bonds we form, not hope, not the other pursuits of meaning we might find in our work. And until they back that up, that point is invalid. I would now like to go on to rebuilding some of government's contentions. Our first contention was ingenuity. And they did not deny that they denied that Sisyphus was innovative in his life. They said he simply just caught death, could put him in chains. It's brute force. But how do you think about doing that before anyone has ever done it before? That's not an easy thing to come up about. They're also neglecting the fact that he managed one of the top countries in all of the ancient world very, very well before he died. And they said he was selfish. And yes, that is true. He did do a lot of stuff for himself. But what he represents is more important than these small quibbles that we might have with his character. His ingenuity means more for us as you try to conquer disease, as you try to conquer natural disasters, as you try to embrace the fundamental human experience. Our second tension was hope, and our opponents barely refuted this. They said, sure, they have hope, they have ambition in life and persistence in death, but it's unwise and his unadaptability is actually not good. I've already refuted both of those contentions while I was refuting their contentions, but I'd like to emphasize something in hope. If it was not for hope, why are we still here? None of us know the meaning of life. If it was not for hope, wouldn't we have killed ourselves long ago? If it wasn't for hope, wouldn't we have neglected to do almost everything that we do? This hope that Sisyphus has, this hope that Sisyphus represents, is in us all and fundamental to the human experience. Our final contention is meaning, and I'd like to elaborate on that now. The opposition said in their speech that Sisyphus should have just dealt with what he was given, the circumstances he was given. And let's take a look at how he did that. He was subjected to one of the cruelest punishments that could be thought of in the ancient world. And yet, he created meaning through that punishment, through two routes. The first is an existentialist route. He created meaning by pushing that rock up that hill. Every day he did it. And soon it became his purpose to do it, to someday have the hope of gaining freedom. That is his purpose. And having a purpose is so important. And if we could do what Sisyphus does, if we could find purpose, maybe we could be content with ourselves and be content with our human experience. He also creates meaning from another route. He always hopes to discover some meaning, to discover some freedom, even if chances seem bleak. This should send a message to us all, that we gotta keep looking for meaning in our lives. Even if we think we'll never find it, we're not religious, we're not an existentialist. How do we get meaning? We have to keep looking. And it is this pursuit that keeps us going. It's this pursuit that is fundamental to our human experience. And for those reasons, because the fundamental human experience is all we have, just because Sisyphus has had some bad qualities, it does not mean we should neglect what he represents. And because what he represents is so important to human progress and to our everyday lives and our pursuit of meaning, that this resolution must pass. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I think I'm just going to go. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, at this moment, I'd like to refer to the wisdom of the Serenity prayer, which says, God, let us have the courage to change what is within our power, the serenity to accept what we cannot change, and then the key part is the wisdom to know the difference. Now, it's true that in some cases, being more having more grit, being more, having the ability to persevere and be ingenuitive and pursue your own meaning can be beneficial in moderation. However, Sisyphus does not represent these ideals in the good way. The myth of Sisyphus is a warning tale because he distorts these, at face value, good things into unmanageable proportions. He does not have the wisdom to know what is within his control and what is not. And what the Greeks and Romans were warning us of was that we must recognize the things that are outside of our control and leave them be and trust in God and not have that immoral nature. And that is where their case is short-sighted, because they're blindly advocating these values without realizing that Sisyphus is not an actual representation of them at their best, but them at their worst, and the pain and suffering that following these values blindly, as the government wants you to do, really is, Mr. Speaker. And for those reasons, that is why they're not understanding the fundamental purpose and the wisdom of the Greeks and Romans in advocating for this broken, immoral man. Now, they've continued on the path of their rationale, saying that the human experience is important. But we're not talking about whether Sisyphus is worth discussing. We're talking about whether he's admirable. And they've consistently not connected that to the rationale. So in the speech, I'm going to first address their three contentions. I'm going to attack the government's case. I'm going to then rebuild our own contentions and explain why their refutations are just oversimplifications. And then I'll conclude by summarizing the case as the opposition sees it and explain why they have not met their burden of proof and why we have won this debate. Now on to their contentions. First of ingenuity, second of hope, and third of the pursuit of meaning. Now, in their point of ingenuity, they conceded that we were right. They said that Sisyphus was an immoral man, that he was selfish, that he did things, but there's things more important than these. And the word they used was quibbles, that such immorality and self-serving nature was just a side gig to the more important notion of his ingenuity. And to our point that Sisyphus wasn't actually a genius or actually that creative, he said that his creativity came in his ability to think of challenging death or to defy that convention. However, again, as we've stressed, that wasn't ingenuity, but just a lack of perspective. People probably have considered, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful for me to not die? But the reason they didn't is because they recognized that that ultimately wasn't wise, and it wasn't what was worth striving for. So this ingenuity that they're pushing isn't actually any clever way of automating a process, any advancement in medicine, but just doing something that people thought of doing, but dismissed because they weren't stupid. And so they've continually not addressed why this ingenuity is actually the type of creativity that we want. Would you rather live in a world where people see ingenuity as finding new and better ways to help people, to make advances over nature that cause good? Or do we want to define ingenuity as just doing things that people thought were so immoral and wrong that they didn't do them before, and you're the first one to commit that new crime? Congratulations, you're a genius. Now on to their second contention of hope. And they basically defended that this point by saying our points were wrong. However, that's just not true. Yes, it's true that Sisyphus represents a certain ambition, a certain persistence, but as we mentioned in our point of information that they conceded, 1,000 years is a really long time. So Sisyphus had tried for a couple months, really stuck out to the whole pushing a boulder up a hill. Maybe he could be a shining example of grit. However, Sisyphus has continued pushing, not at this time, has continued pushing this boulder up for thousands of years, and it hasn't gotten easier. He continues to suffer. He continues to toil. He continues to break his back doing this incredibly arduous and, as defined, impossible task at which he will never succeed, having this false hope that it will come out better on the other side. And we think that, again, this demands perspective to know which fights you can win and which fights you can't. Yeah?
Humans have struggled and failed to conclusively provide a meaning of life for thousands of years. Should we all commit suicide right now?
No, we should not. Now on to their third point about the pursuit of meaning. Now, they said that Sisyphus pushing a boulder up the hill is just a form of to create your own meaning in an existentialist standpoint, and that he's finding it in a terrible situation. However, again, that's misguided because this terrible situation was not something that was inevitable. Existentialism says that when confronted in the human condition, all we can do is generate our own meaning. But that doesn't mean all meanings are equally valid. to have a selfish definition that causes you pain without the slightest possibility of benefit, which is what the myth says, because Sisyphus will never reach the top of the hill, is an ultimately self-destructive definition. But I'd now like to summarize this case and take a step back and see why we have won it. Now, the government wants you to overturn this 1,000 years of wisdom that we have, that these actions are wrong, that this is a man that we should not be like. And we believe that that's simply not the case. And so I'd like to ask you, Mr. Speaker, 3 questions. And if the answer to any of these questions is yes, then they have not fulfilled their burden of proof. Is it better to recognize what is in your control? And we believe that yes, it is. Because unlike Sisyphus, who after thousands of years of experimentation, after conclusive evidence that he is on the wrong path and that he is only causing himself suffering, he refuses to change. He has this misguided hope that is unwilling to adapt and unwilling to find a new path. And so if you believe that people are on this careerist mindset and this treadmill in which they will never escape and continue suffering out of this misguided devotion to grit, then you believe that they have not fulfilled their burden of proof. Second is the point of, should ingenuity be directed to humanity's benefit or be self-serving? And again, we think that it should be directed to humanity's benefit. Do you think that if you are just the first one to come up with this new idea, if you are the first one to think of a new way to defy the will of the gods and to be unwise, you should be celebrated for it? Or in their own examples, should you be like people who, like Jefferson or Hamilton, who were celebrated not for their sins, not for the ways in which they lied to their family, defied God, or were arrogant, but were great in spite of that, because they used those qualities to help other people, to create a government where people were more free, instead of just self-serving. So should ingenuity be self-serving, or should it be for humanity's benefit? And third, to the point of wisdom, should we know when to quit? Should we know what is within our control? And the wisdom of the Serenity prayer tells us that that's not the case. And so is the wisdom of human mortality. And they said that they didn't think that you could find meaning in life and that you had to extend it beyond death. But that's just not the case, because we must accept the inevitability of death, as Sisyphus has to come to terms with himself as he continues to be in denial. And we must be wise enough to recognize that death is inevitable and live with that fact and find a meaning not to suffer against it, but to find a meaning that lives within the parameters. So for these reasons, if any of these answers were yes, this resolution must fall, and we cannot emulate Sisyphus. I didn't like my closing.
I thought it could be done better, but I don't think it was bad.
Yeah, but I think it could have done a lot better.
All right, let me get my, and then we'll exchange some feedback. What? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to begin with something the opposition said about the Serenity prayer. They said that we need to accept what we cannot change. And this is their fundamental misunderstanding. Because we will never accept what we cannot change. That is their closed mindset that prohibits them from seeing why Sisyphus is great. Because the ancient mindset of the Greeks and the Romans are wrong. And we see that clearer than ever before with technological innovation, with more hope, with more ambition than ever before, with a bright future ahead of us. Let's consider this resolution. We would look up to Sisyphus in some ways, is the resolution. And in that perspective, we on the government have proved what we need. That in some ways, ingenuity is good. And it's not denied that he daringly thought of new things, that he managed his top country very, very well. It is not denied that he had hope, and hope is necessary to succeed. Hope is necessary for us to continue. And as they conceded in the point of information, we should not all just kill ourselves because we have failed to conclusively find something for thousands of years, even if it is something as vital as the meaning of life, because we have hope that someday we might. Hope is necessary. Ingenuity is important. And meaning is what backs up all of what we do. These are some ways in which we can look up to Sisyphus. So yeah, even if he has bad qualities, That's not the resolution. The resolution is not we should look up to him in general. It is we should look up to him in some way. But for the sake of debate, we are even willing to consider the overall, the in general way of looking at Sisyphus. That there is a lot of good, as we've stressed again and again. But yes, sometimes his arrogance got him into trouble, made him unadaptable, made him hurt people around him, and made him slightly unwise, making a few bad decisions. But if you think about it, isn't that kind of beautiful? That he is able to do all of these things. He has all these good qualities mixed with the bad. And yet he persistently, vociferously pursues his meaning. As in The Great Gatsby, we are constantly pushed back by the tides towards that green light, but we keep going towards it, and maybe someday, after rowing for so long, we finally achieve our meaning. We finally might get what we want. That's beautiful to us on the government. So no matter what perspective you take, Mr. Speaker, we urge you to vote in favor of the government. Thank you.